Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Good afternoon, Felipe.
Good afternoon, how are you?
Good. Welcome, everybody. My name is Rita Gonzalez. I am the Terri and Michael Smooke Department Head and Curator in Contemporary Art at LACMA. And I'm very honored to be hosting this conversation and to be with Felipe Baeza today. Felipe, I'm so happy to have you here to kick this off. The work in question that is play, we're going to talk a little bit more in depth about. It's called Untitled. It's parenthetically followed by so much darkness, so much brownness. And I want to first give a little intro to you, a little background bio. You were born in Guanajuato, Mexico. You came to the United States. We'll talk a little bit about that. And lived in Chicago, and now you're living in New York. Across town right now at the Mistake Room, sheltering in place, is an exquisite survey of your work thus far. There's about 60 works included at the Mistake Room. An exhibition that's called Through the Flesh to Elsewhere, curated by Cesar Garcia. And we're hoping to, and when the Mistake Room can reopen, that we'll have another chance to re-inhabit that space and see the show again. The show is something that we'll also talk about in a moment. But continuing on your bio, you did your BFA at Cooper Union, you did the MFA at Yale, graduating in 2008. You've had solo exhibitions at the Fortnite Institute and Maureen Paley Gallery. You were one of the inaugural artists in residence at Next Haven. You also a recipient of the Joe Mitchell Foundation Award. And I'm very happy that you will be in the forthcoming Prospect that was supposed to happen this fall, but is now postponed till next fall 2021. The title of that is Yesterday We Said Tomorrow, curated by my colleagues and friends, Naima Keith and Diana Nawi. So very excited that that will be coming up for you. Wanted to just talk a little bit about my experience, briefly about my experience of seeing your show earlier this year. Your work has had, from the beginning, a commitment to the figure, a commitment to the body, to queer figuration and queering the body. I noticed walking through the exhibition that has about 60 works, the different scales, the different tonal ranges, different palettes and textures, and the forms of hybridized figures that inhabit your work. And there was a beautiful review and flash art that said that your figures appear to exist in a liminal state beyond topographical boundaries. That's true. The figures either whether they're solitary or whether they're embracing or in more intense physical contact with another partner, they do tend to loom on the paper. You were trained as a printmaker, collage, printmaking are very important, fundamental to your practice. But in terms of the bodies and space, it was interesting that she talked about that relationship. The writer talked about that relationship to topographical boundaries. And I thought we could use that as an entree to talk about the work that's in view from here, because that is an early work for you that you did when you were at Yale, still at Yale as an MFA student. Felipe, I know you wanted to give a little bit of background before you talked about the work and thinking about this notion of bodies bound or unbound in space as a way to leap into this discussion.
No, definitely. First of all, I want to thank you, Rita, for allowing me to be in conversation, but also on the occasion of the piece that's now at LACMA. But I guess I also just wanted to introduce myself, obviously, to an audience who probably hasn't seen my work or hasn't heard about me. and bring up a bit more context. So I guess in order to talk about the work that's in the show right now, it's important to share a little bit about my background and context. You know, my artistic trajectory is tied to a history of migration. You know, I was born in Mexico, as you mentioned. I was raised in Chicago, and I was first exposed to art in my preteen years, growing up in Pilsen, which is a predominantly Mexican neighborhood in Chicago. But also, if you grew up in Pilsen, primarily in the '90s, you were exposed to murals, to political art, and this is where, in many ways, you know, I saw the importance of political art as a tool, but also being exposed to a museum now that since then has changed its name. I think it was called the Mexican Fine Arts Center Museum, and having that exposure now to art from Mexico and being exposed to prints by Orozco, you know, by Leopoldo Mendez, and seeing how obviously that was also such a critical tool in part of the history of Mexico as a way to disseminate social and political concerns. But you know, leading up to high school, college didn't really seem like an option or a reality for me because of my immigration status. Luckily, at that time, there was a national portfolio day, which is basically like a college fair for art institutions, and I had gone with a couple of friends, and I had basically met representatives from Cooper Union. Um, and they saw my portfolio, my sketchbook, and they gave me an early admission application that, you know, I didn't really take seriously because I knew in many ways I wasn't going to be able to afford it, not knowing that Cooper Union was a fully funded program. You know, I ended up applying, you know, I got accepted, and to think back on that, it's extremely quite progressive to think as Cooper Union as a very obviously very progressive institution that not only accepted undocumented students, but also to provide them a full scholarship that made, in many ways, going to college a reality for me. And I think I just would want to be clear that, you know, I had gone to Cooper Union on the sole reason that that was the only pathway for me to, in many ways, attain a higher education. You know, I had no idea or history of what Cooper Union meant, you know, an institution that in many ways, a lot of people that I admire had gone through there. But in many ways, obviously, it was a transformative experience in the fact that I took very much an intensive course in printmaking there, and Silkscreen was a gateway to that. And I wanted to immerse myself fully in the medium, so I took more courses on printmaking and its history. So I primarily, my time at Cooper was primarily just taking printmaking courses in a very traditional format. But also at the same time, you know, I was taking formal classes in painting and drawing, and none of them resonated with me as much as printmaking did in the way of making. And this is in part because I enjoy the process of constructing and layering, which could be seen in my work, you know, to this day.
That's right. And maybe we can go into the first slide. You know, I mentioned the work that is sort of dominates your current exhibition at the Mistake Room. And, you know, we're so lucky at LACMA to have this early work of yours, because I think it's really formative, and it indicates the directions in which you will go in terms of using certain materials and devices, and also testing the boundaries of printmaking, and also collage too, because you hybridize forms, you layer forms. We'll get to that in a second, but, you know, starting with a work that you wanted to point out to me and to us that preceded the work that enters into LACMA's collection, Cahuela de Sueños. If you would talk a little bit about the kind of steps that you took to put this piece together, and
Yeah.
it's not just materially, but, you know, conceptually as well.
I mean, I think it would be good to point out that even before Cooper, I was very much had an interest in collecting images, and images that are like the ones that are being shown, right? And I was archiving these images and interested in and also realizing that obviously there were images that I was reacting in a very certain way. And I was interested in how the body in these images is contained during its transportation, to a new place. But once they arrive, they're still contained, right?
Yeah.
And most of these individuals are undocumented in the U.S. and will be undocumented for several years. And I think my interest in these images was that the U.S. government historically has been very direct about who it allows to participate in social and in political economic spaces, and undocumented people often are not allowed this participation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, in terms of participation as a citizen, for sure. Now, how did that also touch you as someone who was considering a trajectory into the arts? How about that sense of invisibility within culture? I mean, something that we're just been reading about. Actually, there was op-ed in the New York Times about Latinx invisibility just yesterday.
I mean, invisibility is sort of a recurring thing that I have, many questions about. I think I don't want to romanticize invisibility, but for many people, for me and people who I adore, it has served as for survival, right? But also, it's a space that I don't want to be in for the rest of my life. So I think, in response to these images, that are being shown now, I struggled in ways how to figure out how to work with these images. And around this time, I also started incorporating embroidery as a mark making tool,
Right.
But as well
do you want to
as,
go to the next slide, Felipe? Do you want to go to the next slide? Okay.
Yeah, so you can see, I had, treated the image and basically silk screened the image on a paper. And in a way, I was trying to deal with the imagery as a way to abstract such a problematic image, so the viewer wasn't fully able to, in many ways, absorb the image. And here, obviously, the embroidery works as a mode of drawing and outlining, but also as a way of deferring the gaze and almost mimicking paint trims and marks.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, and I guess I would say that even for me as a person who experienced such journey, I also find it difficult to see these images, and I've been, and at the time, I was thinking, how do we work with such images and archival materials to make new narratives rather than replicating the same systems of violence that they were produced? I'm questioning who took this image, why, how was it disseminated, in what context, and I was more interested with these materials to produce a very different kind of rendering and investigation.
Yeah, and the that element of the tactile and the element of actually, puncturing an image, puncturing through the sewing, through the embroidery. Could you talk a little bit about that and what led you to that point?
Yeah, I think, what embroidery, what I mentioned, it offered obviously a very different tactile, but also in a way of embedding two very landscapes, meshed together. If we maybe go to the next slide, here, here's a detailed, obviously, of where you see the embroidered image, and the embroidered image in this case is a road sign that's along the U.S.-Mexico border, which basically reads, warning, if you're entering the United States without presenting yourself to an immigration officer, you may be arrested and prosecuted for violating U.S. immigration and custom laws. So what the embroidering offer in this case, it allows you to see how these two images in many ways are embedded together as a metaphor onto how immigration laws follow and are bound to individuals and to dictate their landscape, a landscape that's very much on fear and being captured. And this is in many ways very much where I begin to conceptualize the idea of the fugitive body.
That's right. And then you actually take this, or you found this map of the United States, which is very much the type of map that you see in public school rooms across the country. It's a it's a pedagogical tool. It's also a tool that, you know, when it's placed in the classroom and the students are doing the Pledge of Allegiance, it's meant to create a certain comporting, you know, in relationship to the state and to the country. Obviously that's kind of a site of conflict for undocumented kids and for undocumented students. So I think we can go to the next slide and talk a little bit about the background for Untitled that's in the collection, because it starts with this found map. I don't know if it starts with the found map or it starts with this particular image. I'm not sure. Maybe you can talk about that, Felipe.
Yeah, well, I guess in regards to the previous image, that I would say that that work in many ways was a significant part of my studio practice and journey. You know, I needed to make that print in order to arrive at the work and basically arrive at the work that's been shown at LACMA. But it also, you know, it's very much this interest, you know, of the body of the work that is much about the middle space that a migrant goes through to reach to the other side, you know. And this interstitial space is often a violent space, right? People in many ways sacrifice everything and potentially could lose everything in their lives, and often put their bodies through terrible conditions just to see what's on the other side. And just to imagine one puts everything on the line to imagine another kind of life is possible, which is remarkable, and which I found the strength in these images for me, you know, as someone who also in many ways had the same journey. So for the map itself, you know, I had this image that I also had, you know, was in the back of my head and thinking about it and thinking obviously about that interstitial space that happens, you know, this in-between space. So I had found, obviously mentioned, I had found the map on the garbage, you know, right after maybe 2009 when I had graduated from Cooper, and had carried basically everywhere with me, and just basically not knowing what to do. And I knew that I had wanted to respond to it, you know, as something, as you said, you know, that I've been in many ways trying to navigate myself, and what does my body mean, you know, how does my body relate to this map? But for a while, you know, I felt extremely, there's a discomfort, you know. I had embroidered the image fully on the map. And in many ways, you were able to see the image clearly. And there was such a discomfort in seeing that I had to, in many ways, push the image and those figures as much as I could, you know, to defer the gaze.
Yeah, that's, you know, that's something that we talked quite a bit about when we last spoke in preparation for this conversation, public conversation. You know, the image that was just prior to us, the found image, there's something about the returning of the gaze, you know, the young man who's crossing and turning back to the photojournalist. Again, like what context in which this was shot, we have no idea. What kind of lighting was set up, you know, all of these things, the kind of theatricality of that image. We have no idea how that was really constructed by the photojournalist. But the looking back, the return gaze is something like the embroidery that will continue to recur in your work. And it comes from this image in a way, but it reads very differently in the later work or more recent work of yours, where it is a little bit about returning the gaze in terms of desire and constructs of queer desire. I don't know how to, you know, jump, you know, leapfrog from one to the other, but at the same time, I would imagine you were starting to work, you know, at the same time as developing this project, you were starting to work through how forms of queer desire would inhabit your work.
Yeah, you know, I think that's, there obviously an interest in both, right? That in many ways relate to each other. And there, you know, I mentioned this really last time we talked, and, you know, I was reading Gayatri Gopinath's book, Unruly Visions. And she clearly talks about this in a very coherent way, in which there are basically two modes of suspension, right? Both being undocumented and queer are modes of suspension. Whereas being queer allows for a path to somewhere in many cases, where being undocumented, you will always be in suspension. So there's obviously an interest in both, and obviously me navigating both, you know, as a teenager in many ways, having to come out of the closet twice, right? Both as a status and, you know, in regards to my sexuality. And both informing each other in many ways, you know, in ways of when to be visible, when to not be visible, you know. And I would say that there are both things that have informed each other, but also one thing that I would say is that there are very much, I guess, as immigrant subjects and as queer subjects, we're not fully complete, and that's sort of my interest in my project and my practice, you know, in regards to fragmentation, that queerness, and I will also allude to being an immigrant and being undocumented, that it's very much a process of gathering the pieces to fully form yourself and ground yourself within these constraints and concealments.
I know, and that's another thing we talked about too, that there was just so, you know, I really felt it so much when we last spoke, is that the things that you were just talking about that you internalize growing up undocumented, this idea of blending in, I think you had mentioned when we last spoke. So maybe you could talk about that in relation to if we go into the next slide, the camouflaging of the figure, and maybe you just kind of walk us through the process that you went through developing this piece.
Yeah, well, in many ways, you know, this, you mentioned, I had started this piece my first semester in grad school, and coming from a very traditional background in printmaking, I was still very much invested in printing. And my intention with the Mac was basically to treat it as a holograph, and which is basically a printmaking process where you add textures in order to create tones. So what you're seeing right now is basically the map, and I'm, you know, starting to align the states and basically just adding texture. And at this case, you can't really see it there, but the actual image is already embroidered in the paper. And then it was also very much interested in many ways not relying on the press, on the printing press. So, you know, my studio in many ways the floor became the press. So I would lay, you know, plastic on the floor, which you could see. And the process basically was a process of just making, per se, monotypes, you know. So I was literally just, you know, laying pigments, there was just tons of water involved, and basically just laying the paper on top, and the paper fully absorbing, you know, those pigments and building up layers, you know.
And if we go to the next slide too, you can start to see, and then the next slide with the detail, I believe. The image that we just saw a few slides prior of the man who's looking back at the camera, looking back at the viewer. And it's, you know, it's quite subtle. And when if you go back to the previous slide, when you just see the map of the United States itself, you don't really notice until you walk around it, you get close to it, you come to it at a certain angle, and then you kind of start to see that face emerge looking back at you. I mean, it's a really powerful experience as well. And I think the kind of push and pull is reflected in what you were talking about, your life experience, your experiences, an undocumented artist, undocumented grad student, and the kind of stakes, you know, that were very present for you as an emerging artist. And I know it's also something that you've talked about, that you also have a kind of push-pull with how you want to foreground that or don't want to foreground that. And if maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I've been thinking in regards to my trajectory, and that I would say it hasn't been an individual one, right? That it's been very much a collective trajectory of people, through my formative years in Chicago, me ending up in New York, where I'm still now, and navigating that as an artist and trying to make art and trying to survive in New York. For the longest, that I guess I could maybe deter from your question, but that I right after undergrad, I took a break, basically in regards to making work, because in many ways I was just trying to deal with a reality that was much direct, which was my immigration status. And that is when, in many ways, I got involved in immigrant activism and doing sort of different actions, and just trying to, in many ways, see how my work could be incorporated. Because there had always been not much at Cooper, but after that, it's been sort of a struggle in the way my work gets talked about in very specific, easily digestible terms. That in many ways I try to control that narrative. But I have spoken about this in the ways my work gets spoken, as sort of titles like the undocumented artist Felipe Baeza, instead of Felipe Baeza, who happens to be undocumented. But also, in regards to my grad school experience, what's very much, it was also a very transformative one, but also a very problematic one in regards to conversations around my work, in regards to the conversations once they saw my body, but also conversations that many people felt vulnerable to have, I think there was also an expectation of what kind of work I needed to make. And I mean, it was an extremely helpful time for me too, in order also to develop that language, and speak about the work clearly and get my thoughts out there, but also to do the work, to given that opportunity to have an interrupted time to fully engage with the work is something I had never had before, or even have a studio. But I mean, the conversations that happened there were very much conversations of me having to teach people. I mentioned this to you, I think one conversation that happened in the studio was, a faculty member telling me how lucky I was. And this is where I kind of questioned him, what do you mean lucky? And this person was, well, you've been served the silver platter. You're queer, you're undocumented, you have a lot to work with, So
okay, yeah,
it's just tells you what kind of conversations are happening in these spaces. And as a person of color navigating that, as an undocumented person navigating that, it's extremely, it takes a toll, but it's been sort of, it's been ways to sort of, many ways to be in charge of the narrative as much as I could.
Yeah, and I think you see that too. I mean, we had focused these images on, the early work that were, so fundamentally important to this piece. But, you see that in the exhibition at the Mistake Room, that there's this real kind of unbridled state, a state of freedom, a state that I mentioned before from one of those reviews that, was about a boundlessness. If you could just, talk a little bit about that more, because I think that was a way to working through a piece like this, and working through, unfortunately, we've had these conversations that have tried to, or instruction that has tried to pin you in one way or another, and tried to bind you in one way or the other. But then being able to use printmaking and collage in such freeing ways, in such challenging ways, to kind of push against even those points of reference that you mentioned at the very beginning, that you came into contact at the Mexican Museum. I mean, I would love to hear more about that kind of that capacity in a sense to kind of take from what you learned and incorporate it in a work like this to the types of permission you gave yourself working in your more recent bodies of work. And we should say too, I'm sorry I don't have the images to show, but a lot of times the bodies are in a state of transmogrification. They're kind of blooming, you know, either there's something floral kind of coming out of them, or vegetal coming out of them. Their bodies in flux, and a number of people have written about them too as mythological bodies, and those are the ones that have this more kind of fantastical quality. There are other bodies that have this more, you know, kind of visceral, you know, corporeal, sexual quality as well, that maybe aren't as rooted in the mythological or the fantastic. But you know, what I sort of getting at is like this kind of trajectory of going from something like this, a piece like this, that is very much about being bound within, you know, a status, and then to the works that are now kind of more like about proliferation and multiplicity.
Yeah. I guess, you know, in regards to the map, you know, that's been sort of the last time I've in many ways made work directly from an image directly in that way. And what this map has brought in many ways was a big breakthrough in many ways. You know, I've been working in this way since then, you know, finding ways that I didn't have to make a print out of this for that to be the work, you know, that in the process of making the print, I did the work, you know, that I wanted to fully, in many ways, accomplish what I wanted to do. That the map in many ways serves as this, you know, seeing, you know, the work doesn't photograph well, and even in person, you know, you may assume it's just a monochromatic, you know, piece of work where eventually, if you're not a lazy viewer, the work starts to reveal itself slowly, you know. And there's this sort of push and pull that happens in particular to this piece, you know, where obviously at first you start to realize that it's a map, you know, the states start to come out, but then you realize there's a face, you know, there's this sort of like, you're trying to make what's really happening. And that's what happens in a lot of the work that I've been making to this day, you know, that there's very much, I'm obviously interested in abstraction, as in fragmentation as ways of survival, and creating those structures that bodies like mine could in many ways prosper and belong, right? I think, you know, for the longest it's like, how to, you know, like, what if the hopes you have are not in many ways cannot be held by the landscape that's in place, you know? So for me, it's been able to create the structures, you know, where I'm creating, you know, individuals' bodies with different complexities, right? You know, I think that's the language in regards to immigration, that our bodies are talked about in very specific ways, you know, as far as, well, Mexicans, you know, we have very specific terms, walls, criminality, illegality, and someone who talks about this in a very coherent way is someone who just published a book, The Undocumented Americans by Carla Villavicencio. And she talks about this in a certain way that obviously that we're in many ways digestible in the language of labor, you know? Yeah. That we're people that love to work, you know, that we have a connection to the land, to the dirt, and that's all basically that we're formed by. And in many ways, you know, it's like, that is the conversation that is happening. But
you know, well, I just wanted to say too, I mean, that has an interesting relationship to Chicano art and the framing of labor, and you know, obviously its roots, of course, in relationship to it as a tool, you know, the art as a tool, as a tool of protest, as a elevation of the laborer, and of course the connection to the United Farm Workers and other labor movements related to Chicanismo. So I don't know too if there was something within that you internalized, or how you even feel that might have relationship to your work.
Well, very true. It's like there. It's a history that obviously that I knew of. No, but I think also as a I wouldn't say first generation, maybe 0.5 generation, born here, that I felt very much disconnected from Chicano history. That I think it was very much I wouldn't say much of a very different generation, because obviously there are Chicanos my age, but that there was I feel such a disconnect, because I think I was also in this very interstitial space, which I think a Chicano could be in this in-between space, where I think made it worse by being undocumented, because of this ideas of, for the longest, trying to, in many ways, find a structure to belong in, and not finding that ever, and my relationship to Mexico is also a very strange one too. I rarely say that I'm Mexican, and because there's such a disconnection from that too. What does that mean? If being Mexican is being born there, then yes, I'm Mexican. But I think we also talked about this in regards to how maybe my work is seen in Mexico, and I truly believe they see me as an American artist, whereas here I'm seen as a Mexican artist, and I'm neither identify with both. But it's going back to those conversations in regards to how the work also gets critiqued, and how the work was critiqued in school, and also in regards to labor, as if this assumption that I was trying to impress people with what I could do, and there was no conversation, rarely any conversation around color, anything aesthetically. It all had to do basically as if I was making didactic work. What is there to learn from this? And just seeing how my other peers were getting critiqued, and in this sense, my white peers, were getting critiqued, and no question in regards to their whiteness, and how that in many ways impacted their making. So definitely.
Yes, because so much of what you're attempting to do and still attempting to do is, I think, I keep returning to this word, inhabiting, that there's a way, in particular, you talked about the color in this work, the iridescence, and it's something that you really can't document, like this image that we're seeing. You don't see this absolutely incredible iridescence that you do when you actually see the work in the gallery, and that has to do with the mica, I believe, in the powder, and there is a kind of almost rainbow effect. Now, you spoke to me in this really amazing way about how there is this kind of almost like biographical detail, but it's embedded in the material, and it's embedded in the process. I had brought up, one could say it's like, the coloration of Hudson River painting, or, like we talked about Frederick Church, or, all of these things that one could connect to, the sort of notions of the sublime in American landscape painting. But then you also brought up this, kind of internalized and embedded detail that was important to you about the coloration and the striations of the sort of iridescence in the work.
Yeah, thinking obviously that it could be seen in the work since the map to this day, that there's very specific palette that I'm interested in, that and that's happened through the process too. And it's a palette that very much I connected to my migrating, that migration in many ways happens at night, or in the break of dawn and right in the morning. And I remember in many ways, I was 7 when I left, seeing this sort of luminous, sort of purple, vibrant landscape, and trying to mimic that. That in many ways, that was sort of the landscape of transportation, that I was in many ways transporting somewhere else. But also in regards, that brings out also ideas about visibility and visibility, that's the reason why it happens at night, but also seen as night as a space of transformation, where, obviously you talked about these bodies becoming something else, and in many ways blending with their background. So definitely, it's something, that I've heard other immigrants who have gone through the same situation speak about it, and it always gets spoken in a very poetic way. We left, 4 in the morning, 5 in the morning, or this sort of like, it was this luminous sort of purple, just very, yeah. So that's where I was trying to get at with this piece and with the work that I'm doing now, as far as a color palette, referencing a very specific moment.
I know, Felipe, I think we had talked about maybe just ending up the conversation, talking a little bit about this past year, and what it's been like for you. I mean, obviously you had the show that went up in Los Angeles, and then we all had to shelter in place, and I'm sure you've had, obviously you were going to be involved in Prospect that was supposed to happen this fall, and I don't know if you could just talk a little bit, the exhibition of the recent acquisition exhibition we titled after Cristina Fernandez's series called View from Here, which has to do with really sites and her excavation of different sites in the Southwest, but it also has to do with, the time that we're in, this sort of view from here. And there's this conflict of, having very interior, having to be inside a lot, and interiority, and kind of, going into oneself, versus the sort of external pressures and insanity that we're dealing with geopolitically and on a national level too, going into an election year. So I don't know if you could talk a little bit about how you've been holding up, and what you've been, what's been sustaining you.
I've been holding, to say the least, we talked about this briefly last time, and, in many ways, it's been extremely interesting navigating this, in regards to COVID, just seeing the trajectory of many individuals, and just seeing how everyone was directly impacted in many ways, and I think what I found interesting when people ask me, how are you doing? I'm doing, I was like, I'm doing great, and to me, and not to dismiss the fact that, the seriousness of the situation, but the reality was, it's like, this is nothing new to us. As undocumented people, we have lived in isolation. We have lived in quarantine as mode of survival, And I think what brought out of this was also seeing how people weren't able to mourn their loved ones or be with their loved ones.
Yeah.
And that's the experience of a lot of undocumented people, to not be able to say bye to their loved ones, it's like, when am I, it's like, I probably will never come back. So it was interesting for me to see that trajectory of, I ended up getting sick, and pushing through that, and just seeing how it took a toll on my body, and recovering from that. But just also seeing how it's directly impacted, Black and Brown communities in so many ways. But, it's been, obviously a very strange, unsure time, but also I think a very interesting time to, where I feel like in many ways, imagination has been sort of my survival mode, my tool of survival, and, I started getting back into the studio just recently, and in many ways, there was such a numbness to making work. It's like, do I really need to be here in the studio? And I think we talked about this, and in regards to artists, it's like, oh, I don't know how to respond, like, I don't know how to react to the times. And it's like, how are you reacting before?
Right.
Like, is it just because you were not, like you were not very aware of like other situations happening around you? So
Exactly.
it's been interesting.
Yeah, I mean, this ability, I guess, that of artists to sort of retreat into the studio, or this notion that one retreats into the studio. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly, exactly. Um, well, I am looking forward to getting back into your exhibition,
Thank you.
and of course, we're also looking forward to reopening at LACMA and seeing the work in a different context with a number of other of your contemporaries globally. Your work is next to the work of Huguette Caland and to Lynette Yaramwache. So I feel like there's a kind of range of approaches to portraiture on that wall. And I'm very excited for people to come back to LACMA to see the exhibition. And I'm hopefully for you to see it at some point as
No,
well.
thank you. No, I think I do want to say that, it's immensely, beyond the validation, obviously, that this in many ways gives me, but just to see, going back to my trajectory, never envisioning these landscapes happening ever,
Mm-hmm.
and just the way that in the last 3 years, a lot of things have shifted personally, both in my life personally, but also in my professional life, and having this be in LACMA means a lot to me, especially this piece, with the support
Mm-hmm.
obviously of many individuals and Barbara Schuster, which I think she's on the Zoom
Yes,
call,
hi Barbara.
board, which I extremely am thankful to her, for being one of the people to make this happen.
Yes. Well, thank you, Felipe. And, we're going to look forward to getting into your shows and our show and looking forward to seeing what you're going to do for Prospect next year. So I want to really thank you for joining us and thank everybody out there for joining us. We'll be back soon with more conversations related to you from here. So thank you all and have a good day and be safe, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.